Good morning, everyone. We are going to go ahead and start up day 2, second and final day of the Margolis FDA workshop on optimizing the use of post-approval pregnancy safety studies. My name is Gerrit Hamre. I'm a research director here at the Duke Margolis Center for Health Policy, focusing on primarily the FDA portfolio of projects that we have here. Very much enjoyed yesterday's opportunity to contribute and participate with all of you. The activity both here and virtually was really wonderful. As a reminder, we are convening this workshop under a cooperative agreement that we have with the U.S. Food Drug Administration. The conversation today, while supported through a cooperative agreement with FDA, is not a federal advisory committee, so we will not be voting, making recommendations, etc. Also, as a reminder, this particular meeting is tied to an a PDUFA VII FDA commitment to develop a framework to identify and meet the regulatory needs of designing optimal studies to obtain safety data in post-approval settings. Now, we recognize that there are other important clinical needs for pregnant women, maternal, fetal, and infant outcomes. We have discussed them yesterday. I imagine they will come up a bit today as well. But day 2 of the focus really, really does focus specifically on the draft framework, and that was discussed yesterday. At risk of an ad nauseum reminder, we sincerely encourage you to submit comments on the draft framework to the docket prior to its closing, end of day November 30th, 2023. Also would like to remind you this is the first iteration of FDA's draft framework, hence the importance for your contributions as they can work on subsequent iterations that follow. To that end, thank you also for recognizing that FDA colleagues in some ways sometimes can be limited in their ability to respond in detail, but certainly encourage as much active participation. All of your feedback given will help inform framework updates. We began the workshop yesterday talking about a variety of those key challenges that inform the framework, but also the broader set of maternal, fetal, and infant outcomes. Later in the afternoon, we learned about the efforts at the FDA to address these challenges that we've seen in the development of pregnancy safety study framework. Today we'll build on those learnings. I'm looking forward to more future developments. We'll begin the day today with an open public comment session where individuals who have previously requested to provide an oral comment on post-approval pregnancy studies will have the opportunity to do so. We've got a couple folks here in the room, and then we've got a couple folks that signed up virtually to participate. We'll jump into that in just a moment. We'll then transition to session 5 of the workshop, where we'll hear about the expected demonstration projects that are looking to fill existing gaps in the design and performance of different pregnancy safety studies. Also used to inform the development of the framework and capabilities of Sentinel and BEST in responding to questions of pregnancy safety. After a lunch break, our last session will then highlight feedback on FDA's pregnancy safety framework. We've got a wonderful panel. We very much appreciate your comments and participation there. And then on our next slide, I apologize. That workshop agenda should have been up there for that last piece. Give folks a moment there to look at it. Statement of independence. We always like to remind folks that the Robert J. Margolis Center for Health Policy is part of Duke University. As such, it honors the tradition of academic independence. On the part of its faculty and scholars, neither Duke nor the Margolis Center take partisan positions, but individual members are certainly free to speak their minds and express their opinions regarding important issues. Also, just a reminder to everyone, once more, we will not be monitoring the Q&A function in Zoom, since in-person attendees do not have it. We've been using the Q&A platform called Slido for live audience and questions. Please take a moment if you are here or virtually to scan the attached code, the attached QR code, or navigating to slido.com. You can also go there and enter the code PregSafe. Please also, for folks virtually, continue to submit your questions. We received a bevy of excellent questions virtually yesterday. And although you may not have heard people calling in virtually, that's because we were receiving them electronically, sending them up to the moderators, and the moderators were incorporating them when possible during the meeting. Thanks also for the same level of active participation that we had from you all yesterday. It was wonderful, both the dialogue during, in between sessions, and after. Lastly, I'm sure we'll still get a few messages about this today. Happens every time. I'd like to remind you that meeting materials, including agenda, speaker bios, are currently available on the Duke Margolis event website. The recording of the workshop and copies of the presentations will be made available on our website. Generally happens just a few days after, certainly within a week's time. All right. We are going to move on to the open public comment section. Bear with me if it's a little wonky for the first two virtual ones. We will make sure that they are heard loud and clear. I'm going to start with those virtual participants. So, Sarah Obacon, if you could unmute yourself, confirm that you can hear me, and then,
Yes,
I can see you. I see you there.
Oh, good.
Good morning. Good morning. Would you so kindly introduce yourself? I'll confirm that we can hear you just fine, and then we'd be very interested in hearing your public comment.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you to the organizers and the participants for guiding such an excellent workshop. My name is Sarah Obachan, and I'm a maternal fetal medicine physician with training in reproductive toxicology and teratology. As any maternal fetal medicine practice, our team cares for pregnant patients with complex medical conditions as well. And I'm commenting this morning as the medical director of the Exposures Clinic of Mother to Baby Florida, where we care for patients who have questions about medication exposure. As we know from the literature, pregnant patients take on average in the US more than 4 medications during their pregnancy. And therefore, to ask for future research some unfortunately difficult tasks, I would ask that our research projects help answer the issue of polypharmacy and how these medications interact with each other. Also, in line with the principles of basic teratology, I would like to stress the importance of research focusing on the specificity of exposure in terms of timing during that pregnancy, the specificity of both dose and medication compound utilized when evaluating the very specific fetal and neonatal outcomes that we really want to know about. Lastly, and I know this is not exactly in line with today's workshop, but I think really important, I'd like to encourage all of us to help in the realm of education through our work in academia and government and in the pharmaceutical industry, and any number of national and regional organizations such as Mother to Baby. I'd like us to focus our resources and our time in teaching the clinical providers and our patients alike about the risks and benefit of taking those medications and really the risks of chronic disease on that pregnancy. This is really how the work that you're doing today and how the future work that will come out of this meeting helps those patients we care for clinically every day. Thank you again for all that you do and the time that you have spent during this meeting.
Sarah, thank you as well. Very much appreciate your participation and contribution. Next up, we have our second and final virtual participant. Is it Al Romeo? Al, do you mind joining us, introducing yourself, and I'll confirm that that we can hear you okay.
Thank you. Yes, thank you to the speakers and everyone behind the scenes that made this event happen. I'm Al Romeo, a Teratogen Information Specialist with Mother to Baby Utah and a member of the Organization of Teratology Information Specialists. Now, at the 13 Mother to Baby affiliates across the U.S., we talk to pregnant and breastfeeding individuals and their providers every day. They have questions about different medications. Often they don't know where to find the information, and even if they do find the information, they don't know how to interpret it. We rely upon the different pregnancy registries and the studies to provide future information on those many medications that have not been studied yet. We also rely upon those studies to provide more information about those medications where there's limited studies that don't provide clear and consistent information. As we saw with COVID-19 vaccine, in the example from yesterday's presentation about rheumatoid arthritis, patients and providers often respond to limited or no information by stopping needed medications, even though avoiding those medications may be worse for the pregnancy. Now, continued funding of the studies and expansion of those studies is needed to provide the research to answer those questions from patients and providers and avoid those adverse outcomes for pregnant individuals and their children. So thank you for all that you do, and I appreciate all of that work. Thank you.
Thank you so much as well. Glad that worked out actually pretty well with the virtual contributions. 2 in-person volunteers to participate as well. First, I'm going to start with Katie Schubert. Katie, do you mind stepping up to this microphone and introducing yourself and sharing your public comment?
Great, thank you. I'm, not on?
Oh.
It's on? It's on now? Okay, there we go. Thank you. I'm Katie Schubert. I'm president and CEO of the Society for Women's Health Research. And I'm really pleased to see everyone here today, and I appreciated the opportunity to join virtually yesterday, so that was really great to be able to do that. And I am here on behalf of SWHR, but also as a part of my own longstanding work to advocate for policy and regulatory action that will better include pregnant and lactating populations in clinical research broadly. And I remember attending the May 2014 meeting at FDA when I was representing the Society for Maternal Fetal Medicine. And around that same time, we founded the Coalition to Advance Maternal Therapeutics, which is still chaired by SMFM, but the administrative home is at SWHR. And so given all of that, we really appreciate all of the work that's gone into this topic. I do think it's a step in the right direction, just like that initial meeting back in 2014, and I hope that we can work together to move this potential framework forward more quickly so that the data and research needs are better integrated into the approval and post-market surveillance process. There were a few things related to framing the issue generally that I wanted to just reiterate and note, and really appreciated being brought up yesterday. This shift in the frame of reference from not just focus on birth defects, but also the maternal impacts, really critical. And also thinking about the endpoints and the outcomes and what are we really trying to achieve here. I think all of this is going to be really important to the intent of the framework, but also to support that shared decision-making piece that was talked about yesterday as well. To that point, one of the issues that was identified at the CAMET meeting initially was access to the data or information from those exposure registries. So back in 2014, you'd go online, you'd get a little note that said, please write to the drug sponsor and we will mail you a copy of the results. Just upon initial inspection yesterday, it's so much easier and better, so thank you. I think probably we have some of the internet to thank for that, but also all of the work to think about how we can make sure that people have access to these things, and we'll be much better off for that. We do see these registries as one of a few critical ways to further this inclusion, and we've heard anecdotally from SWHR's working group on autoimmune that this is critically important. We did hear this yesterday as well, but I would argue that for a woman with something like lupus who has made a painful decision to never have children, we're probably far past time to be thinking about how we can make sure that if that is the path she so chooses, we can help to figure out how to make that happen for her. So on behalf of that working group, thank you again for doing that. A couple of things on the draft framework, that consistent approach, the upfront, more proactive approach versus reactive, that's really exciting. I think a really thoughtful and intentional approach to this is going to be critical. I also understand we're talking about pregnancy safety, but I would be remiss if I didn't say there's lots of other data points and elements we need to make sure we're looking at to incorporate back into, not just on the safety side, but on efficacy and thinking about the maternal health crisis. And when you have a framework that is final, and we will be sure to do public comments by November 30th, we do welcome the opportunity to have FDA and others present to the coalition so that we can work with our corporate partners and our nonprofit partners to get the word out about this to better educate all of those members. So thank you again for allowing me to provide these public comments, and we appreciate the opportunity to continue working with you.
Thank you so much, Katie. And then our final volunteer for the public comment session was Lee Cohen. Lee, thanks for joining us up here.
Good morning. It's terrific that we're able to do this in a hybrid format with so many people joining us virtually, but I would be remiss if I didn't start by saying that it is terrific to be here in person and to see colleagues who many of us have not seen for, frankly, before the pandemic. And so I want to thank the organizers for putting together such an elegant hybrid meeting. My name is Dr. Lee Cohen, and I'm the director of the Center for Women's Mental Health at Mass General Hospital in Boston and professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. I'm also one of the principal investigators of the National Pregnancy Registry for Psychiatric Medications, which is based at MGH. The registry was established in proof of concept fashion back in 2008 on the shoulders of my colleagues, particularly Lewis Holmes at the North American Anti-Epileptic Drug Registry, but with a focus at that time on new psychiatric medications that were coming to market and for which there were very sparse reproductive safety data. Our initial work, and work that continues, was on the second generation antipsychotics, such as aripiprazole, quetiapine, lorazepam, olanzapine, which were being used not only for psychotic illness, but also as a mood stabilizer, an augmentation strategy for major depression, and a wide variety of off-label uses, such as anxiety, insomnia, and obsessive-compulsive disorder. The registry has expanded to include study of newer antidepressants as well as sedative hypnotics and psychostimulants. Over 3,000 women have enrolled in the prospective registry, which includes an internal non-exposed control group to a medication being studied, but in women who've experienced psychiatric morbidity. Medical records are obtained after delivery to ascertain information across a host of obstetric, neonatal, and neurobehavioral outcomes, but the primary outcome variable for the registry is risk for congenital malformations. Rate of procurement of medical records is 86%, and retention of the cohort has been approximately 90% across the life of the registry. Identified cases of presumed malformations are adjudicated by a blinded dysmorphologist, and we've published extensively on the methods of the registry and results which derive from various analyses of the registry data sets. And the registry is funded with a manufacturer model outlined in the FDA guidance to industry on registries. We learned early on that in the case of second-generation antipsychotics, these medications were not teratogenic on the order of thalidomide. And then as the sample sizes grew, we learned that these medications, as a class at least, were not teratogenic on the order of sodium valproate. And now, 10 to 12 years later, we can say with greater confidence, we can speak to the low likelihood of rates of congenital malformations that do not appear to be greater than what we see in the general population. As a clinician scientist and a reproductive psychiatrist specifically, what I've learned in over 35 years of taking care of psychiatrically ill patients before, during, and after pregnancy, and it so dovetails with the comments yesterday, is that no decision is risk-free, and no decision is perfect. And at the end of the day, if you ask me what I've learned in terms of taking care of this population, is that at the end of the day, nothing is more important than maternal wellness. So what is the ideal post-approval surveillance methods to assess safety of medications used during pregnancy when there are 5.5 million births per year in the U.S. and when 50% of pregnancies are unplanned and when use of medication during pregnancy is so common? Yesterday in the afternoon, a potential framework for surveillance was discussed. Indeed, we have more and more administrative databases available with large numbers of pregnancies among birthing persons taking a variety of medications. But despite how attractive the possibilities are given those large available data regarding a host of medications, what really is the quality of those data? Are they good enough to ascertain a signal of risk? And are they good enough to use as a basis for what I tell patients in my clinic every Wednesday morning? I think the jury is frankly still out. That being said, the path to meaningful data from a prospective medication registry is a long haul, and small sample sizes and at least initially wide confidence intervals is a challenge. And so invariably an amalgam of methods will be probably ultimately used to delineate reproductive safety of medications as patient and clinician collaborate and as patients apply their own calculus as they weigh risk and benefit. What did not get discussed yesterday directly? There was mention of the productivity of registries where there's a post-marketing requirement or a post-marketing commitment in place. But what about the majority of medications which are approved and where there is no PMR or PMC? Post-marketing surveillance for such medicines is a very substantial lift, absent any leverage to support such reproductive safety surveillance activities. And there was a question posed yesterday during one of the sessions to one of the panelists, and I would propose again that there is enormous variability across pharmaceutical manufacturers with respect to supporting the science that is described in this meeting. Many manufacturers may list an existing registry in the medication label as they are obliged to do so by FDA regulations, but these same companies will defer participation of support of registries as outlined in the FDA guidance to industry on registries. They don't really do it because they don't have to. These nuts and bolts issues of support of reproductive surveillance initiatives is really important and has to be incorporated into the formulation of any new post-approval surveillance framework. I remain optimistic, frankly, that there is a path by which we can leverage the resources of FDA, academia, industry, healthcare systems, and advocacy groups to learn the most about the medications that birthing persons use to have the safest pregnancies possible while sustaining maternal well-being. Thank you.
Thanks so much to all of our presenters, both in person and virtually. Now I'm going to pass the microphone over to Dr. Evan Myers, who will be moderating the last two sessions of the day.
Thanks. Excuse me. Thanks, Gerrit. I'm Evan Myers. I'm a professor in the Department of OBGYN at Duke, an epidemiologist, core faculty member at Duke Margolis. I'm also vice chair of Duke's IRB for reproductive risk, so I review every protocol that both includes and excludes pregnancy. It's my pleasure to moderate these last two sessions. In this session, we're going to explore the existing gaps in the design and performance of different pregnancy safety study designs to better inform the development of the framework. Our presenters are Dr. Trish Bright, who's the Associate Director for FDA's Sentinel system. She'll be sharing what we can expect in terms of the demonstration projects with the potential to expand our understanding of study design and data sources to further enhance the pregnancy safety framework. Next will be Dr. Judy Morrow, who's an Assistant Professor in the Department of Population Medicine at Harvard Medical School and Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare Institute. As the operations lead for the Sentinel Operations Center, she'll be sharing the role of the Sentinel system in monitoring for pregnancy safety. And finally, Dr. Joanne Gruber is an epidemiologist in the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research in the Office of Biostatistics and Pharmacovigilance in the CBER Surveillance Program at FDA. She'll be speaking on CBER's Biologic Effectiveness and Safety, or BEST initiative, and the surveillance of biologics in pregnancy. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Bright for the first presentation.
Good morning, and thank you for having me. So my name is Trish Bright. See if I can get the clicker to work here. Oop. There we go. So my name is Trish Bright. I am the Sentinel Program Lead, and I'm an FDA epidemiologist. And I want to thank you all for coming here. And we're going to be discussing the PDUFA VII pregnancy safety demonstration projects and how they might inform the pregnancy safety framework by addressing knowledge gaps. I'll start by discussing the PDUFA VII pregnancy safety commitments. Then, before I discuss the gaps in knowledge, we'll have an overview of what we already know. Then we'll discuss the demonstration projects A through D and how they can inform the pregnancy safety framework. And you'll see what A through D are on the next slide. Then we'll discuss FDA's Active Risk and Analysis System, or ARIA. So you'll see on the left-hand side here is the Pregnancy Safety PDUFA VII Commitment Letter that some of my colleagues discussed yesterday. Today we'll discuss Part 2 and Part 3. So part 2 is incorporating feedback from part 1 and conducting 5 demonstration projects to address gaps in knowledge about the performance characteristics of different study designs. FDA will initiate the following demonstration projects, which may be modified as needed before September 30th, 2024. You can see on the right-hand side there's A through E. I'll be discussing A through D because my colleague will be discussing E. And then part 3 is by September 30th, 2027, based on the results of the demonstration projects in part 2, FDA will update the framework. So what are the gaps in knowledge about performance characteristics of different study designs? We already know a few things about the data generated by different study designs. So this will be a bit of a review of what we discussed yesterday. Yesterday, we heard people discussing registries and also discussing descriptive safety studies. These are the non-database studies. With the registries, we have systematic collection of pregnancy-specific data in real time, and they offer a comparator. But it does require patients to enroll. The descriptive safety studies are without a comparator or predefined sample size, but they also involve systematic collection of pregnancy-specific data in real time, but they also require patients to enroll. So traditionally, pregnancy registries have been the preliminary design or method to fulfill post-approval pregnancy studies. And Dr. Zhao discussed this a little bit yesterday when she showed us the historical trends. So why is that? Reading clinical narratives that include temporal sequences of events in the context of comparators helps clinicians to evaluate causality when there's a limitation imposed by small sample size. And data may become available sooner when each enrolled participant, is enrolled. And we heard Dr. Sheehan discuss this a little bit yesterday. Sorry, Shaheen. And then could database studies also help inform safety assessments? So again, a little bit more of a review. We discussed this yesterday. So now we're going to talk about database studies. We have signal detection and signal evaluation. In signal detection, we can have 2 options: no pre-specified outcome, like tree scan, which offers broad coverage, non-specific confounding control, and can be conducted at intervals as data accrues. With pre-specified outcomes, for example, sequential surveillance, rather than all outcomes, this approach involves a set of targeted outcomes. And the power to detect is higher for targeted outcomes than for all outcomes. It has targeted confounding control and can be conducted at intervals as data accrues. For signal evaluation, we have a pre-specified outcome. Often we use an active comparator, and we can use a new user design. Together, this offers high internal validity. And using real-world data to conduct longitudinal studies of medication safety and leveraging biostatistical techniques to mitigate bias and to conduct statistical testing of hypotheses. And this can be used to quantify rare events. And we may hear some more of this in the next presentation. So what are we hoping to gain from the demonstration projects? The use case demonstration projects will provide data to both inform and challenge our collective view of the strengths and limitations of the study designs for assessing pregnancy-related outcomes in different contexts. Insights provided by the use cases can help us to update the proposed framework. So in here, I've grouped together Project A and Project C from the pregnancy safety demonstration projects as they were listed in the PDUFA VII commitment letter. Both of these projects involve pregnancy registries versus electronic healthcare database studies. Both involve exposures when the exposure is common. One approach will have signal detection, the other signal evaluation. And this will help us to understand the strengths and limitations of these 2 study designs and the study approach. Project B is a single-arm safety study versus electronic healthcare database study. The approach is signal detection, and the exposure will be rare. And this will help us to understand the strengths and limitations of these two study designs when the outcome is rare. Project D will assess the performance and usefulness of major congenital malformations, or MCM, as a composite outcome using signal detection and signal evaluation when there's true risk for some but not all specific malformations. This will help us to understand whether using MCM as the pregnancy-related outcome of interest is appropriate or compromises assessments in some context with a potential for dilution of effect. Assessing MCM is required in most of our pregnancy-related PMRs. And MCM is relatively straightforward to study in claims. But understanding the performance characteristics of different methods and MCM algorithms is important for us to know. So also in the PDUFA VII commitment letter, it allows for some modification of these proposed projects as the protocols are developed to help us better address the pregnancy framework gaps. So how might the findings of these 4 demonstration projects inform the proposed pregnancy safety framework? On the left-hand side, you're going to hear some of the context elements we heard yesterday, like the sample size, the market share, patterns of use, toxicity risk, severity of disease, etc. On the right-hand side are the study approaches that we just discussed. So we want to put these together, the context and the study approach, and determine in what context should a registry study, a database study, or both studies be required at approval. And I'm going to pause on this because this is an important question in what we're trying to address through this framework. In what context should a registry study, a database study, or both studies be required at approval? We know what the demonstration projects will tell us some things that help us with the proposed framework. For example, the demonstration projects will consider frequency of exposure. The demonstration projects will consider study design, non-database studies versus database studies. The demonstration projects will consider signal detection versus signal evaluation. The demonstration projects will consider whether MCM is an appropriate outcome. What else are we doing to address knowledge gaps? Well, the drug utilization information is still coming in and will include data on products not included in the current analysis. Data will also include further analyses, such as based on a year of approval or number of drugs in class. And we'll be developing approaches to estimate the magnitude of exposure. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit now and talk about the Sentinel system and FDA's Active Risk Identification and Analysis System, or ARIA, for those who may have less familiarity. The Sentinel initiative was launched in 2008 in response to the FDA Amendments Act, or FDAA, 2007, which mandated FDA to develop a post-market active risk identification analysis, or ARIA, system for medical products, incorporate data on at least 100 million patients by July 2012 from both public and private sources of healthcare data, have the capacity to both identify and evaluate safety concerns for medical products. On the lower right-hand side, you'll see some statutory provisions the FDA must work with. So VDA requires the FDA to determine whether ARIA is sufficient to assess a serious safety risk prior to requiring a sponsor to conduct a post-market observational study of their medical product. And I've included here one of the guidance for industry that I find helpful. Now, in the lower right, you'll also see 3 purposes that were described yesterday in the presentations. Section 50503A states that the post-market studies and clinical trials may be required for any or all of these 3 purposes. What I wanted to show you in the lower left-hand side here is a publication about how the Sentinel system was built out. It was built with the capabilities to address FDA's needs. And it started with a signal evaluation and worked its way down towards signal detection or signal generation. And the text in here is lifted from that publication in case anybody wants to go back and look at it. I also wanted to show people that on the upper right, you'll see a slide that looks familiar. This was presented yesterday, and it describes how much do we know about the risk based on available information. And below, you'll see also 3 categories that are akin to those purposes in the red box below. And you'll see them tied to different study goals, including signal evaluation, signal detection. So in other words, the Sentinel system was designed to help FDA address the statutory needs. And we have the capabilities within the Sentinel system to address things like signal evaluation and signal detection, the very things we've been talking about in this workshop. Now I want to talk a little bit about ARIA. ARIA uses a subset of Sentinel system's full capabilities to fulfill the FDA mandate to conduct active safety surveillance. ARIA is comprised of analytic tools and a common data model. The analytic tools are predefined, parameterized, and reusable programming, or off-the-shelf programming, to enable faster safety surveillance in Sentinel, in contrast to protocol-based assessments with full customized programming. The Sentinel Common Data Model is mostly electronic claims data, transformed locally into the Sentinel Common Data Model format at each data partner. And the data is kept with the data partner inside their firewall. Each data partner runs analyses using the data programs and sends the de-identified results to the Sentinel Operations Center. The Sentinel distributed database is a collection of harmonized data sets from many of the different data partners. We're using the ARIA system to meet the FDA requirements for FDA to determine whether ARIA is sufficient to assess a serious safety risk. We keep metrics on our use of ARIA, including the challenges. On the next slide, I'll be showing a select set of metrics. This will be reflecting regulatory needs that were considered but did not use ARIA because there were challenges in capturing the outcome. So this is the distribution of safety concerns insufficient for assessment in ARIA attributed to capture of health outcomes. And I know that the font is small, but if you look at the top row in red, you'll see that the majority of these were driven by pregnancy. And so often the outcomes of part of our pregnancy interests is studying MCM. And the demonstration projects will help us to better understand the performance characteristics of different methods and algorithms for MCM. So in summary, the demonstration projects, other ongoing work, such as the drug utilization data, and importantly, feedback from this workshop will provide insights to inform the proposed pregnancy safety framework. The demonstration projects will also help us to consider in what context a registry study, a database study, or both studies should be required at approval. But we don't expect one size to fit all. The demonstration projects will also help us to consider whether using MCM as a composite pregnancy-related outcome of interest is appropriate and what context it might be appropriate. So the next presentation will provide more information about CEDAR's Sentinel system capabilities that could support the demonstration projects. So I want to thank you for listening.
Good morning, folks. Just checking that everybody can still hear me. I always have to lower the microphone at my height. So I'm going to pick up right where Dr. Bright left off. So talking about how we can use the Sentinel system to respond to FDA's regulatory needs in monitoring medication safety in pregnancy. And I want to say that this presentation is broken up into largely 2 parts. So the first part is to talk about and familiarize you with the data and the tools that have specifically been developed in response to what Trish just showed you, that finding of ARIA insufficiency. And then the second part of the presentation is to think about how those tools can be put to use in order to perform these demonstration projects. So I'm going to start out to say that, again, as Dr. Bright mentioned, the analytic tools were specifically designed to respond to FDA's regulatory needs in what we call those 3 prongs of FDA, is the way that we refer to those. So those are the Amendments Act for monitoring the safety of medications in pregnant individuals. So this is a chart that basically outlines the chart that Dr. Bright just picked up. It's just to say that, again, that top reason for why ARIA was deemed insufficient was the inability to adequately measure adverse pregnancy and fetal outcomes. And I want to say that the system has changed over time. So the launch of the Sentinel system officially is January 1st, 2016. And every time we sort of progress through time, we look at ways to invest in how to reduce ARIA insufficiencies by either adding data or tools. And so when we think about these inadequacies, the first thing that we think about is, which is the problem? Is the problem the data, or is the problem the tools, or both? And so the harder thing to fix, the longer leg to fix, is the data. So we started there. So this is a graphic that we have on the website, and it shows over time how we have introduced enhancements to the Sentinel Common Data Model to fulfill FDA's regulatory needs. And so in 2018, again, starting in responses to these findings of ARIA insufficiency, we added a mother-infant linkage. And at that table, we started off with commercial claims insurers who have access to protected health information for their members, who can do linkage at a rate of approximately 70 to 80% in terms of the total deliveries. And then later, we added Medicaid data. And in the Medicaid data that we added, we don't have access to that protected health information, so the linkage rate is slightly lower. So right now, this is a current state of affairs of live birth deliveries available in the Sentinel system. I'm focusing here on live birth deliveries as that was part of the insufficiencies, but we also have mechanisms to identify non-live birth deliveries. But with the live birth deliveries, total now, we have 13.5 million pregnancies with a live birth delivery over the years shown. You can see that there is a rise sort of in this middle area. This is where Medicaid data has been added in order to supplement the system, and you see that there's substantially higher numbers when Medicaid data has been added. All told, with those 13.5 million pregnancies, 10.8 million can be linked to an infant, so around 80%, which is the balance of the Medicaid averages and then the commercial claims averages. But an important point here is that when we apply standard enrollment criteria, when we require enrollment during the entire pregnancy and a slight pre-pregnancy period of both medical and drug coverage, which is typically used to increase the internal validity of the epidemiological studies that have been discussed so that we can ascertain particular covariates of interest and things like that, we see a narrowing quite quickly. So we get to 7.3 million pregnancies after we put all those criteria into effect. So just something to consider. So in addition to using that data, we turn our focus with ARIA insufficiency from the data to the tools. So how can we create tools that then can be used to access these data and to create evidence that can be used for regulatory decision making? And so consequent with the development of the mother-infant linkage table, we have developed propensity score adjusted tools. And as Dr. Bright had mentioned, the focus first was on tools that dealt with targeted outcomes, right? So things for signal validation. And so this is just a little graphic to talk about, again, very similar to what Dr. Bright had mentioned. The goal here with the Sentinel system was to be able to address all of those 3 phases of signal management. So from signal identification and detection, some descriptive safety studies, and then signal validation using a causal inference framework and common epidemiological designs. And then there's the ability to do that at a one-time study analysis. So that was what Dr. Bright was talking about with signal validation. And then to do them as data accrue. So those are over time with multiple hypothesis testing that's been generated. And just, as she had said, just backing it up, these are tools that are parameterized at program execution. They've been pre-tested and quality controlled. They have a standard output. And so once we build tools, we try to validate them. And so with the signal validation tool where we started with a study by Dr. Hernandez-Diaz and Dr. Hubrooks, who for the folks who are virtual are sitting right in front of me. So it's a study onto pyramid and oral clefts, and we use these tools to do a conceptual replication of that study to ensure that we were getting the same types of answers. And as a standard procedure, because we're invested in the transparency of these tools, we do training on them after we develop them so that we can involve other people and collaborators in thinking about how to parameterize these tools, how to set up their own studies, how to use them when they have data that has been formatted into the common data model. And this training was done in 2020. So when we turn our attention from targeted outcomes now to untargeted outcomes, so this is where we call it scanning or data mining. We're scanning an area to see if there is any unusual occurrence of outcomes that may be associated with an exposure. We look at entire sections of the diagnostic tree of ICD-10 codes that are used in both billing and clinical data. And so we start out, so you see at the top of this graph, you start out with everything in what's known as the Q section of ICD-10. So this is everything related to congenital malformations, both major, minor, everything in that area. And then as we work down, you see that there is a narrowing by particular organ system. And then when you get to the very, very specific, so in this particular example at the bottom, you have spine disorders that are in particular regions of the spine. So you have the ability to do data mining and scan over this entire space from the very aggregate to the very, very specific. But scanning takes power. So every time you look in one of these places, you're taking away from your overall study power to find something. And so there's a balance here between what you might want to do when you have a very specific hypothesis and you have a targeted outcome, in which case this kind of method is not really the most appropriate, versus when you don't know what you're looking for and you just want to be certain that you're scanning that entire space. And so here just as, again, sort of putting together the targeted outcome type studies and the untargeted outcome type studies, both of them identify a cohort, both of them create exposure episodes using medication dispensing. There was some discussion yesterday about some of the limitations for that, and part of the public comment this morning was about some of the limitations for that, so I'm not going to go over that again. The main difference is really about the outcomes. So when we're doing a targeted outcome study, we're typically using a validated algorithm. When we're using a scanning process, we're not having a validated algorithm for everything we're scanning. We're just looking at the presence or absence of diagnostic codes. In both cases, propensity score methods are used to control for confounding, although in different ways because of the untargeted nature. There's sort of a different sort of a context to what the propensity score means. And then the different results that you get. When you have a targeted study, you're going to get an effect size and a confidence interval. When you have an untargeted study, what you're going to get is what we call an alert, which is what we say is pay more attention to what is going on here. There is an abnormal sort of a pattern of outcomes that are occurring that may or may not be associated with the exposure. They might be chance, they might be due to confounding, they might be a real thing. So what it's really telling you is this is something I need to pay attention to. And so as we did before, when we create a tool, we validate it. So we have two studies here that looked at one, what we think of as a sort of a negative control, and others in a simulation study to show that what we are intending to do actually worked. And I should also say that a very similar study was performed by Dr. Hubrex's group with a positive control, demonstrating the same thing. And so again, very similar pattern. When we develop a tool, we do the training. So in 2023, we did training on these tools and how they can be used by anybody who has data that's been formatted to the common data model. And this is, again, a commitment to transparency and also a commitment to allow people to comment on and use and tell us more about these tools. So back to ARIA insufficiency. So now we've worked on investment over time in the data. We've worked on investment over time in the tools. Now what's still left? And so one of the things that's true about ARIA is the boundary of ARIA does not include medical record review, does not include chart validation. And so there is a concern about whether or not these outcomes are truly what we think they are, right? And so there have been multiple outcome validation studies in the ICD-10 period, particularly for terminal pregnancy outcomes, for live birth, for preterm birth, for stillbirth, for spontaneous abortion. But there have been very few studies that have validated adverse infant outcomes in that ICD-10 space. There are a lot in the ICD-9 space, but not necessarily the ICD-10 space. And when I say a lot, that's relative. There are not a lot of validation studies overall. I don't want to give you the impression that there's a lot going around. So with the current state of that investment in the Sentinel analytic tools, how can we meet the needs of FDA in support of the pregnancy framework through these demonstration projects? So this is just a little graphic. I'm not going to go through it because Dr. Bright did it so well, of all of the commitments, A through D and E. But some of the key questions for the demonstration projects, and this is really echoing, I think, a lot of what I heard yesterday. The goal is to generate real-world data that is both accurate and timely and can be quickly converted, in this case via analytic methods or tools, into real-world evidence. And so I want to focus on these two features, the accuracy and the timeliness. And again, this is somewhat of the review. So the registry-based data, as we've been talking about, that uses primary research collection methods. And so we think that those outcomes might inherently have a higher level of accuracy because you're actually asking a person the question you want them to answer. Whereas in secondary use methods, you're just using the data that you have, and there may be additional validation that needs to happen. Although yesterday we did hear from the CDC in their VSafe program about if you're not really specific about what you're asking, you can still end up with registry data that's somewhat messy and difficult to parse. We also have timeliness concerns. How can we accrue this data as quickly as possible? And so we've heard about challenges with under-enrollment and such. So some of the key factors, I'm not going to belabor this, but just thinking about operational measures that we can incorporate into these demonstration projects, exposure sensitivity, exposure specificity, outcome sensitivity, and outcome specificity, particularly when there is a target outcome that is part of the process. So one of the things I wanted to bring up to folks here is that it's important to really agree on these outcome definitions, even in a targeted analysis. So this is a paper. It's from a group that does registries, and this is 3 different registries that looked at the same set of case data and said what they thought was a major congenital malformation. And you can see those 3 different numbers of prevalences are sort of all over the place. There's 46, there's 22, and there's 7. And these are different groups of people looking at the exact same data. We also, in electronic healthcare data, if we don't well define our target, we can end up with prevalences from 2% to 20%, depending on what we actually describe as a major congenital malformation. So we really need to get our arms around a common definition that we all agree to so we all can be measuring the same thing. So some of the questions, again, bringing this back to the role of chart validation and how chart validation works in this system. And does it work differently if we're thinking about a signal detection framework versus a signal evaluation framework? And so in a signal detection framework, is there a difference in terms of our tolerance for false positive versus false negative error with respect to the potential for chart validation? And I want to bring to you an example of something that we did as an experiment when we were doing a validation of lymphoma. And so in this particular publication, we used something that's called a claims profile. So this is a line list of all of the things, temporal sequence of what happens to a person in their billing data. It's not the same as a chart, but it's actually really very comprehensive in many cases. And so we had clinician adjudicators look at these line lists and predict what they thought would be a true case of lymphoma. And so the 2 clinician adjudicators that we had tagged a number of, right there, the numbers were 87% where they got it right, where they basically, they predicted this would be a true case, and then chart validation bore out that was a true case. And in the cases that they tagged, but that weren't them, they were typically other related cancers. I'm not a clinician, so I can't say what's related, but just that they were something that was in the neighborhood of lymphoma, but was not lymphoma. And so this might be a technique or an opportunity to do something, because chart validation is really quite resource intensive and expensive. These claims profiles can be created quickly, and they can be as a way to sort of screen things so that we're using our resources sort of in the most cost-effective and optimal way. So another thing that we talked about was how to actually treat major congenital malformations. Should we treat it like a composite where we look at 30 to 40 different things together and we look at them, or do we create something like a modified tree? So the tree that we've been working with in untargeted outcomes is much bigger than major congenital malformations. It includes many more codes, and maybe we're spending time scanning there when we really don't want to. Maybe we could limit a tree to just the codes that comprise major congenital malformations and think about whether we're going to save power and how we're going to balance power and time to signal. So these are the types of questions that we're thinking about during these demonstration projects. And so some takeaways from the talk today, that Sentinel has the data and the tools available to perform the demonstration projects, that we're trying to explore and quantify material differences in the best approach. And we're paying particular attention to accuracy and timeliness in multiple approaches, But I would actually suggest that there's a third thing that we oftentimes don't consider because we think, oh, we're about the science. But this is addressed in the public comments today, and so I want to say something about it, which is that we have to think also about the cost effectiveness of this. All of this requires a funding model, and it requires a funding model that's sustainable and that creates the most evidence for the amount of resources that you have. And so thinking about how to do this in a cost-effective way is not really a very minor consideration. It's an important part of the overall picture, so we can create a sustainable system. The demonstration projects here are a framework that's designed to be generally useful. So what we're trying to do is be robust over all of the possible situations, but we won't be able to sort of assess every single thing, what I think of as corner cases that are unique. So we're trying to do something that's going to generalize. And the goal is to find conditions under which different approaches may be preferred. And as Dr. Bright mentioned, sometimes it may be one or the other or both. There is no expectation that a single approach is always and uniformly going to be preferable under all circumstances. And so with that, I'll turn it over to the next speaker.
I use this mic. Okay, I'm gonna. Good morning. My name is Joanne Gruber. Let me see here. Let me get my slides. There we go. My name is Joanne Gruber. I'm an epidemiologist in the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research in the Office of Biostatistics and Pharmacovigilance. Today I will be speaking about CBER's Biologics Effectiveness and Safety, or BEST initiative, and the capabilities of the system to study safety of biologics used in pregnancy. So here's an outline of my presentation. I'll begin briefly talking about the demonstration project E in the PDUFA VII commitment letter, and then I'll move to introduce the Biologics Effectiveness and Safety, or BEST initiative. And then finally, I'll talk about the capabilities of the BEST system to study the safety of biologics in pregnancy. So as Dr. Bright, my CEDAR colleague, has mentioned previously, CEDAR is taking on A through D in the demonstration projects, and CBER is in charge of the Part E of the demonstration projects. So that is FDA's commitment to assess the performance of an algorithm using electronic health record, or EHR, and claims-linked healthcare data for pregnancy-related outcome or composite outcomes after use of vaccines in pregnant persons. So today I will discuss what CBER has done to build capabilities to fulfill this demonstration project, as well as what we will do in terms of studying safety of pregnancy and biologics. But before doing that, I'd like to briefly introduce the Biologics Effectiveness and Safety Initiative, or sometimes referred to as BEST Initiative, BEST System. I use these terms interchangeably. And so the FDA Amendments Act, which was introduced earlier of 2007, FDA 2007, mandated FDA build an active post-marketing safety surveillance system for FDA-regulated products. So in response to the mandate, FDA established the Sentinel initiative. And so as mentioned previously, CEDAR uses the Sentinel system to monitor drug safety, and CBER uses the Biologics Effectiveness and Safety system, or the BEST system, to monitor the safety of biologics. That includes vaccines, blood components, and gene therapies and other biologic products. So I wanted to just briefly talk about the infrastructure of the BEST system. So the BEST initiative has access to a network of electronic health record, or EHR, databases, as well as large administrative claims databases. These databases are linked to immunization information systems. So those are IISs, and they're local and state jurisdictions that collect information when people get vaccines through their public health departments. And so this was really important early in the COVID-19 pandemic, where people were getting vaccinated outside where there weren't claims showing up in claims databases. So that really has increased our capture of important vaccines. It was also important when we were studying the safety of vaccines used to prevent Mpox, which were also distributed through our local and state health departments. So these databases, in addition to having that linkage, we have a short data lag and adjustment for claims delay. We're often looking at large amounts of vaccines given very quickly over a short period of time, and so we want the ability to study safety very quickly, and so we have a short data lag for that reason. For our databases, there is linkage to some medical charts that allows us to validate our claims, as was discussed previously. Are you seeing what you're really seeing with a diagnosis code, and how can we validate claims? And that is a real trade-off between resources, because it is resource intensive. Our data are in a distributed data network as well. It's an expandable and adaptable common data. We use the OMOP common data model in the BEST system. BEST also has flexible analytic capabilities, and I found that is really important when we're dealing with public health crises, like the COVID-19 pandemic has showed how we have to be really adaptable and change to meeting priorities very quickly. So I'd like to just quickly show the best data sources that we use just to highlight the diverse types of data. We have large administrative claims databases, electronic health record or EHR databases, and then linked EHR claims databases. So next, I'd like to discuss really what we're here about, to talk about our capability to study safety of pregnancy and maternal, fetal, and infant outcomes. So first, I'd like to talk about the work that we've done for validating claims-based algorithms for identifying pregnancy outcomes in claims databases. So understanding the safety of biologics used in pregnancy has been a real priority for CBER. And to conduct safety surveillance of biologics in pregnancy, BEST needs the capability to identify pregnancy outcomes using standard coding systems in the ICD-10 era, and as well as the ability to determine gestational age. As was discussed previously, that switch from ICD-9 to ICD-10 can, really make you have to start all over again. And so this was some of the work that we had to do to do the validation. So we decided to conduct a study so that we could know what we're seeing in our claims databases. So we developed claims-based algorithms to identify pregnancy outcomes and estimate gestational age in our administrative claims data. And then our second aim was to evaluate the performance of those claims-based algorithms by physician adjudication and link EHR charts. So we did this study in the IBM linked claims EMR database, and we studied persons aged 12 to 55 years who are identified as female at the time of the outcome of interest, the pregnancy outcome, and who were continuously enrolled in medical benefits during the pregnancy episode, and had the pregnancy outcome on or after August 1st, 2016, and that allowed those events to be in the ICD-10 era. So for aim 1, again, we identified our pregnancy outcomes using our claims-based algorithms. And so those pregnancy outcomes included live births, stillbirths, and spontaneous abortions. And we identified those using medical codes. And then we also used the best estimate of the pregnancy start date to then determine gestational age. So then for the validation, we did a sample of those pregnancy outcomes that were identified in our claims database. And then we used the structured EHR data and the global alignment of immunization safety assessment and pregnancy case definition to evaluate the performance of the claims-based algorithms. And then we estimated that percent agreement between those claims algorithms and our referent method and estimated our 95% confidence intervals. So here are the results of that study. So this is the pregnancy outcomes are on the y-axis, and the x-axis shows that percent agreement between our claims algorithm and our referent method and the 95% confidence intervals. On the right side of the figure, you'll see the number of records that were reviewed for each of our pregnancy outcomes. So overall, you can see the claims-based algorithms did well at identifying our pregnancy outcomes with the range of the percent agreement from the claims algorithm and referent method being from 62 to 100%. These algorithms did particularly well at identifying full-term birth at 98% and spontaneous abortion at 100%. So similarly, this figure shows the gestational age by our pregnancy outcome. So again, on the y-axis, we have our pregnancy outcome. The x-axis, again, shows that percent agreements between the claims-based algorithm for gestational age and our referent method. And so the left panel shows the agreement within 7 days, and the right panel shows the agreement within 14 days. So you can see on the left panel, we had pretty good agreement when we allowed that 7-day window between our claims-based and referent method, with the range varying by outcome. It was 61 to 86%, and it did. The highest agreement was for our full-term live births at 86%, and then our preterm live births at 82%. So moving to the right panel, when we allow that window to be within 14 days, we see a substantial increase in that agreement. That means most of our claims-based algorithm that for gestational age within 14 days does a really good job at estimating the gestational age. So that range was 80 to 99%, and we had excellent agreement for full-term and preterm births at 99 and 93% respectively. So I went over that pretty quickly. There are a lot of really messy details in all of this work. So if you'd like additional information, I'd encourage you to refer to our published protocol and our published report on the BEST Initiative website, and you can scan the QR code for a quick link there. And also, we have published a manuscript summarizing the results as well. So before I go to the next thing I'd like to talk about, I just wanted to highlight some additional work that we've done to really get at vaccine exposures also in pregnancy, building on the work that we've done to identify pregnancy outcomes and gestational ages. So in this study, we looked at the vaccine exposures in pregnancy and among privately and publicly insured women in the US. So if you'd like additional information on that work, feel free to scan the QR code. So next, I'd like to present the work that we've done to link mothers and infants in our claims databases. So to study just the pregnancy outcome, you don't require that linkage. But if you want to know how does a vaccine that's given in pregnancy or at a specific time during pregnancy, is there an impact on infant health later, we need that linkage. And so we set out to do that, to link pregnant individuals to infants in our databases. So our aim was to link pregnant individuals with live deliveries to live-born infants in our claims databases. So I'll briefly touch on the methods. So to do the linkage, we started with our claims databases, which were Carelon Research, CVS Health, and Optum. And we identified all live deliveries among females 12 to 55 years of age in our database who had a live delivery at least 1 year after our data start date or August 1st, 2016. That allowed those episodes, again, to be in the ICD-10 era. And then next, we identified live-born infants who had a date of birth at least 1 year following our data start date, or August 1st, 2016, whichever was later. And so then finally, we combined those records to see how many of these live deliveries linked to our live-born infants. And to do that, we used a combination of subscriber ID and delivery and infant birth dates. So the subscriber ID identifies the group of people on a given insurance plan, and individuals with the same subscriber ID are on the same plan and are usually part of the same family. And so we required that the mother's subscriber ID match the infant subscriber ID as the first step. And then the second step, we also required that the mother's delivery date match the infant birth date. And so we allowed that match to be first an exact match. We required it exact, and then within 3 days and within 7 days, since there's some variability sometimes in those dates in our claims databases. So in total, we found we identified, this is just the total deliveries by data source, and during the time periods listed, we identified over 2 million live deliveries, and that number varied by our data sources from over 1.2 million to just under 350,000 live deliveries. So this figure shows our linkage rates for the mothers and infants, again, of all live deliveries, what percentage linked to a live-born infant, and that is presented on the y-axis, that linkage percent. And on the x-axis, again, everybody had to match subscriber ID, and then we had that window that we allowed between the delivery date and the infant birth date. Was it the same day, within 3 days, or within 7 days? Each of the colors represents our data partner. So we saw that when we required a same-day match of delivery and infant birth date, we had pretty good linkage rates at 40 to 48%, but that increased quite dramatically when we allowed a little bit of give between those two, like we see in our claims databases. Those dates might be recorded at different times. So we saw that linkage improve to about 70 to 81%. When we allowed that window to expand further, we didn't gain a lot. It was about 71 to 82%. So to just summarize, the BEST initiative is used by CBER to conduct post-approval non-interventional safety studies of biologics. That includes our vaccines. And we've developed several capabilities within BEST to study the safety of biologics in pregnancy, including the ability to identify pregnancy outcomes and gestational ages using our claims-based algorithms in the ICD-10 era, and the ability to link live deliveries to live-born infants in our claims databases. This, of course, all of this put together really focuses on what we're here for, trying to determine and build evidence for safety of our medical products, including vaccines at the maternal, fetal, and infant stages. Our next steps will most likely be to evaluate the safety of a vaccine to fulfill the rest of the commitment with respect to pregnancy outcomes. So in that, I'll just want to acknowledge all of my CBER colleagues, some of whom are here, who have done a lot of work, and our FDA best partners who have done a tremendous amount of work to build this infrastructure. Thank you.
Okay, excuse me. Now we're going to start the discussion. And I'm going to start with a question about gaps and challenges to secondary databases beyond just some of the methodological ones, and in particular, Medicaid. When half of pregnancies are covered by Medicaid, they're obviously a very different population. They're at greater risk for a number of, and Judy already showed some of the issues with that data. So what are some of the kind of broader methodologic questions in terms of generalizability, capturing appropriate populations, and so forth?
And I'll punt that to Judy.
So a couple of things. One, Medicaid data are quite lagged. You're not going to get data that is, typically it's a 2 to 3 year wait depending on what you, so there are Medicaid, they release through their VRDC or ResDoc program, they release 2 releases every year. Their annual releases, and so the data, I think, just from a perspective of monitoring, they're quite lagged relative to other, although there's a lot covered. The other thing that I highlighted was the enrollment criteria. So a lot of individuals qualify for Medicaid as a function of getting pregnant, and so they don't actually start their coverage until they are already pregnant and may miss the most etiologically relevant window of their capture between 3 weeks and 8 weeks, as was discussed yesterday. And so some of the challenge is just the missing data from when they aren't covered and you're not seeing what's happening to those individuals. Also, we've done an extensive amount of work looking at the differences in jurisdictions. There are 53 jurisdictions in Medicaid data, and each of those has a fee-for-service and a comprehensive managed care component to it, both of which the quality is different in those different data systems. And there are a lot of different rules. As Medicaid expands differently in different states, you have different coverage, you have different ability to follow, and you have different sort of access to prenatal care and pregnancy benefits. So those are all sorts of unique challenges of Medicaid as a data source, but I still think it's invaluable. So with all those limitations, I still think it's invaluable.
I was just going to add on too, because I do think that's one of the challenges we've had. It is important to cover as many pregnancies as you can and to get as representative of a population. So I was thinking the same thing about the in bias that we have requiring, when you start looking prior to pregnancy, through pregnancy, after pregnancy, it's a lot of enrollment for our fragmented system. And if people are only getting into Medicaid, because of pregnancy, that's a challenge. And then one of the challenges we have is we're trying to do things as quickly as possible when a new vaccine comes out. And so to have that lag, it's really challenging for us when we're thinking about vaccines, particularly to how to figure out how to include that population, though we would really like to find ways to incorporate as much comprehensive coverage as we can in terms of pregnancy.
Megan.
Yeah, this is Megan Close, rheumatology. At Duke University. One of my main concerns that always comes into my head whenever I read a paper about using health claims data is whether the patient actually put the medicines in their body and when. Do you guys have an approach to validating that, and so we have a better understanding, or sort of statistical approaches to manage that issue?
Get vaccines.
Yeah, I guess I can start. So typically our base assumption is that if it's been dispensed, that we consider that as a medication that's taken. But you can do various sensitivities to essentially test those assumptions, and you can use quantitative bias analysis to try to overcome some of that. But in terms of validating, I mean, really you need to do survey data. You need to send out surveys to folks and say, you know, like, for example, I mean, it would be an expensive program, but you could, you know, give people, you know, a mobile login at the pharmacy and ask them to log in and report if they've actually taken their medications or not. Now, again, there's, I guess, concerns people have about their private health information being misused. And so in the current information environment, stuff like that is very difficult to do effectively and correctly. So it's a challenge.
Something else we can do is if somebody's taking a medication chronically, you can look and see, well, are they getting the subsequent refilled, the subsequent one after that refilled or not? Because if they get it once, even if it's chronic, but then they don't get it refilled again, that's a hint. But that only works with some kinds of medications. And we could do a sensitivity analysis to compare those folks to other folks.
Here's a question from Slido. With increased use of claims data to support pregnancy safety studies, it seems that we should also be advocating for changes to medical diagnosis and prescription recording to help address some of the limitations that we face when using claims data. Has this been discussed, and is there pushback? And I assume that's trying to come up with standardizations for coding and practices across specialties and so forth.
I think in terms of like the electronic health record and changing the components of it in order to ensure that you're capturing more information. One of the things that was brought up yesterday in the panel was whether the onus of that belongs then to the provider who is giving that. So if the provider is required to record that the patient reports that they're actually taking their medications as prescribed and things like that, that all of that additional recording, it just adds to the system. And there's a question about sort of whether the value add, I think, is appropriate given the resources that it would take to do that, or whether we fall back on techniques like quantitative bias analysis and sensitivity as a means to try to overcome that.
Hi, Elsie Grace from Eli Lilly. I have a question that kind of steps back to the earlier parts of the presentation and the framework. So I really look forward to seeing the results of the demonstration project, so thank you for all the work that's going to be going into that. I know that a lot of what we were talking about are claims study versus registry, and I know that we talked yesterday kind of about the surveillance approach, and I'm curious, I hear you when you say the demonstration projects aren't meant to test everything, but I'm curious about where the FDA's thoughts are on kind of where that surveillance approach fits in, and when that might be more considered.
I'm not the FDA, so I'll stay quiet.
Yeah, I mean, I know we use all data streams, okay? So in this talk, we've been focusing mostly on registries and database studies, but we heard yesterday that some very rich information comes in from industry, and so we have to think about all of it. And one of the points I made is not one size fits all, and so the question might be, how do we get an efficient response, and are there tricks we can use to kind of prioritize certain medications to be followed, weighting different types of studies into that full feedback, so we have sort of a more comprehensive approach. I'm not sure we're there yet, and thinking about sort of how the pharmacovigilance on the different type of products is going to complete itself in the end, but it's something we're definitely thinking about.
Simone Pinheiro, AbbVie. Quick question on the framework as well, and I really look forward to learning more about the thoughtful projects, demonstration projects that will inform the framework. I have a general question in terms of the key elements for the framework, and I would love discussions on that. At the time of approval, oftentimes some of that information, such as exposure of the drug or number of exposed pregnancies, is not known. So I'm wondering if you could comment on how that could affect, once the PMR is issued, but if things didn't pan out, the product's not being used as we thought it would be used, or women are getting pregnant, being exposed to the product, how that would affect the discussions on the framework approaches, the selection of approaches that would produce the most meaningful results to obtain information on pregnancy safety.
Yeah, so it's a little bit of a tricky question because we're still focused on Plan A, and you're asking about Plan B. But yeah, it's definitely real. I mean, we're trying to come up with a prediction model to estimate, and that's going to be part of the work that we're doing. But we know that it's going to be somewhat limited. We heard some representatives yesterday kind of saying, hey, we thought this was going to be used in a certain population, and then it wasn't. So in every sort of, as every group gets together to kind of consider this, they're going to always have to think, what's our fallback? What do we do if? And a lot of those discussions happen at the FDA and are internal. And so we're aware of it, but I think at this point, unfortunately, we can't sort of give you a pat answer.
But I would think at least at the level, by the time you go to approval, you'll have data from your trials of the proportion of women of reproductive age and who needed to use contraception during the trial, so that at least gives you a ballpark to start with. Yeah.
Christine Olson, CDC. Thank you. This is really informative. And I hope I didn't miss this earlier, but I think you focused on the congenital malformations and the pregnancy outcomes. I'm curious how well these systems work for something that's really important but really hard to study and that's longer term as development. I'm thinking particularly some medications maybe more than others, some of the psychiatric medications where that may be more of a concern. And I understand how difficult that is just from clinical diagnostics and the variability and how it's coded, but the coding systems seem like they might be the best option for these types of administrative systems for getting at that information, but I don't know how well that performs or how much that's been looked at. Thank you.
Yeah, I would say that is one of the more challenging outcomes that we have to look at. I have seen them in PMRs, and teams have worked on those, but when you're looking at somebody, the developmental characteristics, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, and to get that kind of follow-up, it's hard, it's challenging. We don't have a lot that have gone down that track, but it is certainly an important outcome, and we do need better ways to approach it.
Hi, Lee Cohen. Question and a comment. Dr. Klaus, I agree so much. Your comment about adherence and where that folds in, and I was wondering, Dr. Morrow, after your talk about, is there any way to sort of think about a nested test where you could sort of take a sampling of patients who are presumably taking a medicine and really, in the context of informed consent, actually going to see to measure adherence, so there's some way to factor adherence into the model. It was just sort of, because I agree with Dr. Klaus that having this discussion without really knowing whether the patient is taking the medicine is a challenge. It's a challenge to do that even to the patient sitting across from you in the office, and so let alone if you're looking at claims data. But I was so impressed with your, Dr. Morrow, with your presentation, and I was curious about your vision for trying to, in a way, look at real data in relation to the claims data, to sort of see the extent to which it reflected reality, or well, at least what was in the chart. And do you have a vision for scaling that? That's really my question, because that would probably provide a level of confidence as we use those sorts of data that we just don't have at this point in time. And so I was sort of wondering your thoughts about that.
Sure. So a part of the Sentinel system that we didn't talk about today that was utilized previously was called the FDA Catalyst system. And the FDA Catalyst system was a system that was not public health surveillance. So to be clear, the Sentinel system is public health surveillance, and the Catalyst system was research. And because it was research, there was informed consent. And so there were several demonstration projects, and the goal there was to use the claims-based information as sort of a patient finder. I'm going to find people, and then I'm going to, through the commercial claims insurer, get permission to contact them or their provider and ask them some questions. And if you do that for a subsample, then you have an informed consent. You have the ability to do that. So, all of that is possible. It just costs money. So it's all about resources and the funding model to be able to do that. But there are demonstrated projects that essentially showed you could do that. And so if you use that technique to find a subset of people, to send them a survey, there was actually an approved survey device. It was called the My Studies app. You can still find it, the FDA My Studies app, where that survey device a patient could log on to it, they could answer a short survey, and it would be connected to their longitudinal record. So you could look to see to incorporate those patient-reported responses and see how that measures up relative to what you see in the record in terms of their longitudinality. And that is sort of an optimal data collection system, but I'm not going to, sort of shy away from it. It's an expensive one. And so you just have to have the appropriate funding model in place to be able to do it.
Here's a question for Trish. Are there annual reporting requirements for ongoing pregnancy studies as part of a PMR?
Yeah, so each PMR has sort of milestones on it, and when they issue the PMR, they tell you how often you have to report. And so some do have annual reporting. I'm not sure that all do because I haven't been a reviewer for a while, but I used to look at a lot of annual reports. They do, okay.
Thank you.
So following from some of this, Geeta Swami from Duke University, following from some of the discussion yesterday, I'm wondering about looking at the safety from the perspective of maternal health and outcomes. So when we focus on, for example, preterm birth, and if we think of that as a poor outcome for the infant, many times when individuals have medical conditions they're taking medications for, that preterm birth occurred because it's actually a treatment to improve the pregnancy outcome overall, avoiding stillbirth in the setting of severe preeclampsia and so forth. In addition, looking at things like preeclampsia, looking like hospital length of stay, readmission. So are those factors that would be considered in a safety setting as well? Because if we focus, again, only on the infant outcomes, I don't think we're thinking about this from the perspective of the safety and why we're even talking about these medications in the first place. So.
Yeah, so completely agree that those are important. They're not required in all PMRs. Some things, MCM tends to be required in most PMRs. They're definitely required in some. And so the review teams are the ones who sort of make the distinction. They look at the biological plausibility, they think about it, and they decide what outcomes will be in the PMRs and what won't be. But we have been doing sort of a lot of work outside of, we're focusing on MCM today, but there has been a lot of work in the pregnancy field in general, which includes the mothers and looking at the safety of the mothers and developing tools to address the needs of the mothers as well.
Going back to the feasibility question about what information we have at the time of marketing, could you talk a little bit about how the drug utilization studies might play a role here?
Yeah, so one of the things that they're trying to do is, I think we heard yesterday, is we're thinking about how can we put together this framework and this model and trying to assess what use looks like. So for example, are those products that are later in class, do they tend to have less uptake? And if they have less uptake, are they going to have less sample size? If they have less sample size, we'd only be able to detect a risk of a certain level and that sort of thing. And so the drug utilization data will sort of feed into that thinking, feed into the sort of the sample size and that sort of thing. I don't know if anybody else wants to add on.
I guess I would just say that I think that what was outlined yesterday was the complementary nature of having the claims-based information to try to understand if the prevalence that was being observed was actually because people really aren't using this product in this population. And so you could envision a potential outcome here where there are checkpoints or triggers that need to be met in order for certain things to be able to be completed. And you can continue to monitor that utilization as you go. So let's do a checkpoint at 6 months after approval, at 1 year after approval, and have delayed kick-in of requirements because that constitutes a new safety piece of information. So.
Are there gaps or challenges or things that we're still not going to know at the end of the demonstration projects? And so one that occurs to me is for many women with severe conditions, termination is part of the options. And because for a number of reasons that may not be in claims data, we won't be able to tell how many terminations there were, whether the termination was because of medical conditions or a congenital anomaly. Are there other things that we're still going to want to do a demonstration project round 2, questions that we're going to need to address further?
Yeah, so I don't know that we'd be able to do demonstration projects because like you said, there's some that are going to be outside of this kind of data. Another example similar to what you were saying is very early spontaneous abortions before it comes to medical attention where the woman just has the miscarriage at home. And so some of that won't be captured either. So I'm not sure if there's sort of other areas like that where we could build out additional work. But we do have some flexibility in our demonstration project. So when the work group gets together to kind of consider what to do and where the gaps are and how to use the resources wisely to get at that, they'll be thinking about some of those points.
I guess I would just add that I think we should really strongly consider our current political environment with respect to elective termination. Pregnancy registries, I think, are going to suffer from people who do not want to record some of that information in our current environment, and it's going to make it really challenging to be able to understand what's really happening there.
I wonder if we're thinking about different kinds of outcomes. So when I think about, say, an individual patient and I want to understand what's the dose, what's the exposure, maybe plasma level, and what's the reproductive outcome, we have this really tight kind of toxicity model. And if we're looking at what is the reproductive safety on a population basis, it's a different kind of concept where you're really getting almost a parallel, like an effectiveness study where you're integrating all of the different, did they take it, did they not take it, what about all the other factors? So I think maybe we're trying to do something that's very precise, that's not very precise, but maybe more valid in terms of generalizability as far as what happens when you release a drug into a population. So I wonder what your thoughts are about that.
Yeah, I definitely think population levels is very different than, individual levels. And at the individual level, you often don't know, but at the population level, you're thinking, like, here's what we see. And I think that gets at a point that you had made yesterday, or that was on the panel yesterday, about absolute risk and relative risk. I think a lot of times we're looking at relative because partially there's a lot of, we're thinking about, well, this is a decision, so you could do this and that, so relative to this, should I do that? But overall, we're not contextualizing it. And I think that's something that we need to do in our studies. What's that absolute risk? And that is a population level phenomena.
I would just also say that's why we have our epidemiologists and clinicians work together.
And it also seemed just from a power, if you're powered to look for relatively rare outcomes, you're going to have pretty good precision to look for some of these more common maternal outcomes and health outcomes. I think we've kind of covered the canned ones.
Any other questions from either the audience or online? I'll give it just another moment. We did start a little bit early after the public comment, so if anything, we'll have a little bit of extra time for lunch.
Never a bad thing.
Agreed.
Oh, I think
There's
there's a
someone
question.
behind you.
Hi, Jessica Albano with Syneos Health. I guess just to extend a little bit on, I guess the question earlier around, I guess, ability to accurately then in the changing, political environment around pregnancy outcomes. Thoughts from FDA on maybe relaxing? If we know gestational age at outcome and we know live birth versus non-live birth, to what specificity do we need to know the exact type of outcome and what kind of flexibility? I know in the post-marketing requirements, they very explicitly state the specific, pregnancy outcomes that have to be collected. But is there an opportunity for some reconsideration of how those are worded to allow a little more flexibility for both, whether it's claims or other database or pregnancy registries to collect the necessary information without collecting in such a sensitive way that might preclude being able to actually have accurate outcomes?
Yeah, so I would say that there is flexibility. It was worded, but it was also, there's a section in there that say this can be modified, as needed. And the reason is because when they wrote the commitment letter, it was so long ago, and they have to allow room for those who are sort of doing the work to think about it, just like you're saying. this time, this place, you know, what are the issues now? How has the science changed? And that sort of thing. And so I think that they're hearing what you're saying in your comments at this workshop, and that that's going to help inform how they think about the demonstration projects and what factors and what outcomes they might look at. So this kind of feedback is good because it'll help make these demonstration projects stronger.
I'd also just add and reiterate too that this is a distributed data network, and privacy and protection of information is paramount. And you know, in these systems, Sentinel system, VSD, the best system, we don't have access to identifiable data, and I think that's really important to remind everyone that it's behind a firewall, behind another firewall, behind another firewall. So I think that's something when we're thinking about the electronic health record databases that we can remind too that there's privacy.
Okay, if there aren't any other questions, I think we'll take an early lunch, and we'll see everybody back this afternoon.
We'll begin again promptly at 1:05.
Do you know about value of information analysis? Yeah,